So you've started a PhD and you have no idea what to do next. Look, we've all been there, so it's okay. I'm here to save the day once again. The thing is, when you first enroll in the degree, it's a bit jarring. And that's because research is different to coursework. When you normally would go to class, you listen to the material presented to you, you take your little notes and try to memorize it and understand it in the best of your ability until you get examined later in the semester, only to figure it all 3 days later. Sound familiar? Yeah. So with research, there are no classes or lectures or workshops or anything like that. You just meet with your supervisor once every fortnight or whatever your arrangement is, and to discuss your progress and what the next steps are. And so a lot of students may feel a little under-supported or a little lost, especially in the beginning where the whole thing is quite new. And that's what this video is aiming to address. Your first few days, weeks, or even months where you just feel like you should know what to do, but you kind of don't. So I'm basically going to take you through what to expect, give you an overview of what a thesis is and what it should consist of, give you a guide on where to start with everything, and then I'll talk about writing your literature review and experimental papers, the gap you need to find and address, the purpose of the review to begin with, and how to get started on research on papers with your keywords. All of which you should hopefully give you a good idea of what you need to ultimately submit at the end of your PhD. Oh, and stay tuned to the end where I'll tell you the 2 must-have apps and services you need to download to make your life a lot easier and save you hours of work. I think it's most helpful if we start off with a bird's eye view of everything so you understand the context, and then we can work back from there to establish what it is you need to work on. Sound good? Let's go. So your thesis, just like a book, is divided into chapters. The first chapter is your introduction, then chapter 2 is typically your background and literature review, then chapters 3, 4, and 5 are your experimental papers, and then chapter 6 would be your discussion and conclusion. And these are then followed by a bunch of appendices that contain things such as your ethics application, any permissions, or really anything that you wanted to include but didn't really fit anywhere in order throughout your thesis. And this is based on the assumption that you have 1 literature review and 3 experimental papers, which is generally considered the minimum standard. Now keep in mind, this is how I did it. This isn't necessarily the only way to do it. But my advice was to not reinvent the wheel. What I did was just look at a few other theses that were submitted and accepted from my other colleagues of mine, and just essentially copy and pasted their format. And you may think that's cheating, but in fact, it's actually what the examiners would want. If you're looking through a thesis that's been published, it means it was good enough to be passed. And if it was good enough to be passed, it means that they were happy with the format. So why would I then go and come up with my own format and order when I know there's something out there that already works? You're not copying any content, you're actually making the marker's life easier. By the way, the same goes for when you're publishing your papers, but that's a discussion for another time. Alright, so that's the overall format. And by the way, I've heard that theses could be about 200 to 300 pages long, which sounds very intimidating. But I'll tell you what, it's quality over quantity. You shouldn't be worried about how many pages you've written. You should be focused on the quality of your work that you've written. And if you've done that in half the amount of pages, then perfect. To give you some context, my final thesis submission was only 111 pages. Another colleagues of mine was 175, and another one was 230. So it just really depends. And it doesn't mean that the person who wrote more than me or had more pages than me had done a lot more work or had anything fancy. It just means they had a lot more stuff that they wanted to include. Okay, so that's that. Literally nothing to worry about at this stage, but thought I'd let you know. So after you've done your proposal and ethics application, you'll likely first start writing your literature review. But before that, I think there's another important step to consider. Instead, first think about your research question. And that's really where it all starts. And what you want to do is essentially address that question across 3 experimental papers, or however many papers you've discussed with your supervisors. This is because 1 paper generally isn't enough to explore a whole research question, because each paper is very precise and addresses a certain specific question. I'll use my study as an example so it makes sense, and you can just apply the same concepts to your own study. So my PhD was on creating a novel model for predicting the lifetime dose and risk in screening mammography, where we'd be able to predict a woman's cumulative dose and risk of radiation-induced breast cancer incidence and mortality across a lifetime of screening, from only using their very first screening event, Very cool project. So anyway, for this study, my first experimental paper, aka EXP1, was a prototype. Essentially, the preliminary steps used to set up the model. EXP2 was then the establishment of the model, where I'd used more data and an improved methodology to improve on the model. And EXP3 was the last experimental study, was the model evaluation paper, where I had to set aside a small portion of my dataset specifically for testing the model independently. Now, if you have no idea what your experimental studies are going to be, that's okay. It may just be a little too early to plan them all out like this, because what you'll find is that what you set may actually change. But either way, you should have enough information to at least know what your first experimental paper is going to be, alongside a general overview of where the project is heading, and that's enough for now. And if you haven't caught on, each subsequent paper is meant to be a continuation of the one before it, a continuation of the chapter. Before I started, I was always told that a PhD is a story, or rather that I should be telling a story, and this will become more apparent as you'll see. So once you've established what your experimental papers are going to be, then we can go back and address your literature review. Now, your lit review is best written in a way that is presented as a review of that particular project. And that may sound obvious, or it actually may sound kind of confusing, but what I mean is that you shouldn't just write a review that's very general and broad, based on the overall themes of your topic. You should instead write it and make it specific to your project. And this is actually a mistake that I did, which cost me a lot of months of writing and many rejections from different journals, so learn from me here. The literature review basically has three aims. The first is to familiarize yourself with the literature. The second is to serve as a background and informative introduction to your thesis, and later down the track for the examiners to mark. And the third is to highlight the gap in the literature, which is then what you will address in your experimental papers. And that last one's an important point, so take note. It's this gap that justifies your whole PhD. It's in this gap that you want to come in and hopefully address it with your research question. That is the driving force behind the whole project. So identifying the gap is critical. Now, in reality, assuming that you didn't come up with your research question and you just joined a supervisory team, then they would have already identified the gap, hence the project existing in the first place. But either way, what you'll need to do is write about this as part of your literature review. So just expanding on that first point, think of it. When you started your PhD, it's likely that you didn't know much about the topic that you were going to be researching, and that's normal. I was in the same camp. So what the process of researching and writing the review does is that it makes you more knowledgeable about the current and past literature on the topic. Which is great, because you'll need to know all that stuff to then be able to do the work on your research question. And remember, the second part was that it serves as a background and introduction to the meat of the topics that you're about to present and discuss later. So what you want to do is identify some keywords from your research question and experimental papers that you plan to write, and to then use those specific keywords to search the various databases. Now, searching databases is a whole other thing which you'll need to learn, and what you can do is actually book a time with your uni librarian or any relevant personnel, which you can just find by asking your supervisor. Again, using myself as an example, my keywords would have been something like this: mammography, dose, mean glandular dose, risk, and radiation. I would then combine these with the and or functions and include any variations of these words in my database search. By the way, if you have no idea what the terms and or mean in the context of searching terms, you'll need to book a time with someone to show you how to do a proper database search. Or if you want, you can let me know down in the comment section below. I might make a tutorial on it. So once you do your search, you might end up with a total of 2,000 papers, which sounds absolutely insane and unmanageable, but that's okay, because then you start screening your articles, removing any duplicates, anything that isn't relevant, mainly by having a quick read of the title and the abstract. And once you've narrowed it down to, let's say, 50 articles, you write down your literature review only using those ones. And that is so your literature review can be reproducible if someone did the exact same search strategy. And it's using these filtered amount of articles that you'll read in depth and learn about the literature, write down your key findings, and try to identify whether there indeed is a gap in that literature. Essentially asking yourself, is there anyone out there that's already done the exact study that I plan to do and spend the next 3.5 years of my life addressing? And if no, then we're in good territory and prime for action. And by the way, you should use two pieces of software when doing all this and writing your papers. The first one is called Covidence, which is where you export all of your found articles, and they can use this site to sort of filter through all the articles by quickly reading the title and the abstract. And the other one is EndNote, which is a reference and citation manager. Now these two apps will save you an enormous amount of time, so definitely go ahead and download these or use it on the website as you see fit, and try to use your university links because normally these apps are paid. All right, let's recap what we've been talking about so far. We said that your thesis is like a story, and hopefully now you see what I mean. Well, the first chapter of your lit review is summarizing the current literature on the topic and stating what that gap is and what you're trying to fill. Then the next few papers are your experimental papers, which is where the real main part of your work of your thesis is. Then at the end is your discussion and conclusion chapter that basically summarizes all of your findings from that research that you've done, addressing the main aims and objectives of your thesis. And the very last part is the appendix, which can include a bunch of miscellaneous things. And that's basically it. I hope that gave you a clear understanding of what to expect, where to start, what the next steps are, wherever you currently are at. If you got any value out of this video, I really appreciate a like. And if you have anyone that you think might find it useful, let them know the video exists. All right, that's it for this one. Now this video was kind of like a part 2 of another video I made, which was on how to get into a PhD. So click here to watch that one. I'll see you in the next one. Stay curious.